Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast. And today's guest is Assheton Carter, who's the CEO of TDi Sustainability, who are a global consultancy that helps businesses all over the world to be more sustainable and use their expertise to build responsible supply chains that work for people, work for businesses, and for the planet across sectors, many sectors, including mining. Assheton is an expert and NED on responsible sourcing, sustainability standards, mental markets, non-financial risk and responsible investment. He has a track record of over 30 years with a focus on the resources sector and international supply chains in obviously mining, metals, luxury jewellery, auto and electronics. And he's here today to obviously discuss the material change for renewables and responsible sourcing considerations for the clean energy transition. Assheton, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks, Rob, for the invitation and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, certainly. So, as I mentioned, you've obviously got a long track record within obviously the resources sector and obviously supply chains. So I just wanted to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your career and your background, maybe some things that our audience may not know about you and others out there that may not know about you. So I hand it over to you now.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Well, yeah, no, it's a good question in a way, because I didn't follow a linear path at all. I didn't wake up and saying I must go and do geology at university. It's a bit like you. I kind of found my way there. But no, I started off actually as a trader in the city of London on the trading floors. Trading stocks and shares and trading futures, and then did a lot of kind of different things, including, even party planning at one stage. But eventually I found my way there through, I guess it was a recession, so I took a PhD. So when the economy goes down, train yourself up. And it's really that PhD, which I took at Bath Uni, specifically on mining and sustainability in communities and environmental issues. And that's really where the current journey, or the journey I've been following for the last 30 years, began, I think. And on that, while I was doing my PhD, I came into it thinking, gosh, I've heard all about mining and how this is a number one criminal in terms of environmental damage and social impacts as well. But came out thinking, actually, maybe I was a bit of somewhat of a contrarian, going, what happens if we turn the question around and going, how can mining actually be a positive force and be a driver of sustainable development? And that ended up being the title of the PhD was Mining Companies of Agents of Development. And since then, I've lived in the States, worked for the NGO sector, worked for mining, worked for my own consultancy, and always with the idea of if we can put in place the right policies, procedures, provide the right insights, mining can be this very positive force for development, especially locally, if we can be consistent in that approach. And that's really what I've dedicated the latter part of my career to.
Yeah. Before we speak about TDi Sustainability, obviously you mentioned you studied your PhD. How has the industry changed in terms of the way you see it from back then to what it is now? Has it improved? And obviously you've got your own consultancy, and obviously you try and implement certain changes, and whether companies take those on. But have you seen the industry change since you studied your PhD?
Oh yeah, I mean, enormously. I mean, even then there's always companies which are the standouts in terms they're always doing things well because they follow their own set of values, or they're led by a particular person who has a has a vision and a mission. But in terms of systemic change and the discipline that is in the industry, it's totally transformed in that time for sure. Beforehand you'd expect people to just, mining companies to follow the legal requirements, just about. And now they're kind of sitting at the table and developing what those standards should be, because they're eager to demonstrate to the world that, in fact, when done well, mining can be a very positive force. So yes, it's totally transformed.
Yeah. So why don't you just tell us or give us a snapshot of TDi Sustainability?
Yeah, so TDi Sustainability, I started that with the idea is that there were a number of agencies, which could be engineering agencies or those which specialize in one part of the mining industry when it comes to sustainability, a particular topic, human rights or environment, but not really a organization, not really a company which looked at sustainability as part of the core business. So they didn't look at it in the rounded way. And I think that's, if you want it to stick, that's how we have to look at it. We have to understand the business drivers, and we have to understand how sustainability and ESG and all these things fit into that. So that is what TDi does, is that we work with mining companies, but we work up and down the mining and metals and minerals supply chain and value chain. So we work with standard setting organizations, we work with governments, we work with the downstream companies, the auto electronics organizations, companies, businesses, and we work with the smelters and the mining companies as well. And if we do that, then we can begin to understand what are the expectations of society and customers and begin to build that in and anticipate it. And so there's greater alignment and less friction between in the ecosystem, in the mining ecosystem. So that's the idea.
Yeah. I wonder if you can just give us a little bit of a background to what you mean by responsible resourcing, and also what it means for mining as an industry.
Yeah, so responsible sourcing, I mean, I almost think of it as a movement now, and it has sort of emerged. But in some ways, it goes back to, the idea back in the 70s and 80s when we talked about, fair trade and ethical trade, and we had the fair trade movement, and everybody remembers Fair Trade Coffee and Max Havelaar and these sort of groups. When it was organizations, non-profit organizations, trying to find a market mechanism, i.e. a market brand, to appeal to the values of some consumers who were concerned about where things came from and how much, in that case, how much people were paid to, harvest for coffee, for example, or harvest fair trade bananas, and create a movement from that. So that is, in some ways, that's been around for a lot. But when it comes to mining and metals, it really took off with the Dodd-Frank Act of the United States in 2010, when that was enacted, which is all around conflict minerals. And there's a very effective campaign in the United States. Senators Dodd and Frank inserted this bit on critical conflict minerals into an act which is really there about financial disclosures. And from then on, people have been figuring out how to identify what's in their supply chains. And this is downstream companies, so the OEM have been figuring out what's in their supply chains and whether they are conflict minerals. And it's grown from there. And over the last 12 years since then, 14 years since then, it's now found its way into regulations. So you're in a situation now where these regulations are asking companies in the UK, Europe, Australia, Canada, the US, to identify where all their materials come from, in some cases right up to the mine, and then layer on top many expectations for the environmental and social issues that they should be excluding or doing something about to address if they are in fact found to be kind of wanting in terms of their performance. And the changes which has happened now, and why it really kind of matters to the mining industry, is that going back to that Dodd-Frank, which is just about conflict minerals, and that was just about three tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold in one part of the world, DRC and the surrounding countries. Now it's about all minerals and metals, and not just metals, but other materials too, but specifically for this conversation about minerals and metals, it's not just about conflict, it's about environmental issues as well, and governance issues. And it's not just for DRC, it's the world over. And so things like the German Supply Chain Act require from the beginning of this year that you actually find out where your minerals and metals come from. Over the next 3 years, 4 years, the European Commission has come out with expectations and regulations that are going to affect any company under 1,000, employing 1,000 people, as that's a lot of companies in the EU. So you could say, why does that matter to mining companies if they're based in, Australia, Africa, South America? Well, because they want to sell into those markets, and that expectation is set there. So it's becoming kind of really important in terms of regulations. And then there's a reputation angle, because the ultimate consumers of these metals are reputation-sensitive brands, the auto brands and electronics brands, batteries as well, who don't want to be associated with negative things. And so they're also asking questions over and above what the regulators are asking. So really, for the mining industry, it's about how do we understand where that is headed over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and what are going to be the expectations, and how can they anticipate and put in place those things that are going to meet those expectations of the downstream, because it is sticky. It's not going away. And you find some of these big auto companies and aerospace companies are now putting in place contracts directly with mines to ensure they have the long-term supply of materials that can demonstrate they're meeting the production expectations that the regulations are asking them to ensure. So you asked for a short description. That was a rather long one, but I hope it gives you a sense of the direction it's headed and where it's come from.
Yeah, no, that's fine. How can ESG principles be embedded into companies' core operations, obviously ensuring they go beyond the normal ESG checklists?
Yeah, and it's a good question, because, what you need a framework to put in place these expectations that normally comes with a standard or a certification of some sort. And when you hand that to the engineer on site, that it is going to be a checklist, because they want to know exactly what they've been asked to do. And then very often those checklists get longer and longer. So you can have 350, 380 different things to check off on your checklist, because these standards keep on expanding and expanding and expanding, and no one really takes the effort to say, well, hang on, let's just reduce the number of things we've got to check off. They're only going to expand them. So that can be extremely painful and a very kind of transactional way of doing business. So to really get that embedded into the organization, there's some of those things which always have to be there. It doesn't matter whether it's sustainability or ESG. It could be any policy or value you want to ingrain. You have to have that leadership from the top, of course. And I think for large mining operations, you've got to take a systemic approach. Big mining companies are generally very good at that. How do you incorporate that? You've got to have your feedback loops. You've got to have your continual improvement and so on. But if those topics, if those issues, those ESG aspects aren't in the system, if they're not known, then they won't get into the system. So, you have to have the target on the radar to be able to manage it. And so I think really what we've got to do is anticipate what those things are, and mining companies have got to better understand where society is headed in its expectations of business generally, and with mining companies in particular, to do it. Because once they understand that, then it becomes more intuitive, and you don't have to go through this rather cumbersome checklist thing, but you can anticipate and embed it as well. I think another point on that is that I don't know about you with your experience, but when you go to a mining site, this is a very technical occupation, and there are many engineers, and they approach things in a very logical way. So they love a flow diagram, and they love to be able to measure things. So that's great with the biogeophysical part of our world. But when it comes to the social aspects, people, not quite so logical. So then that's not quite so easy to sort of engineer, and that comes down to people practices. And I think where we're finding the difficult part of these expectations now is delineating what is the responsibility of mining companies when it comes to people's development outside and even to some part inside the fence line, and then how do they go about it and who do they hire? And I think that becomes more difficult on the social side.
What strategies can companies employ to develop meaningful engagement with communities and obviously Indigenous groups as well?
Yeah, I mean, again, and this was very much kind of a topic of my kind of formal studies back in the day. And I think in some ways it's just like relationships with anybody and any community in your own communities. If you can be transparent and you can be open, that's what's going to be appreciated. I think always the first thing, especially if you're going to more remote area, but really any area, is identifying those norms and what are the systems in place in those communities. And so you've got to take time to understand the communities you're working with and how they go about their lives, and then try and meet them halfway when you want to introduce something like a large mine, which is going to be in their territories. And I think that's one of the challenges, certainly, is time, because at any phase of a mining project, you're up against the project timeline, and you've got your boss who's beating the drum and going, how are we doing there? We've got to get to cash flow sometime, cash flow positive sometime soon. How's it doing? How's it going with Indigenous peoples groups you're working with? But the timeline of those Indigenous groups might be totally different and could span, decades rather than years. So, at least understanding that people take time, especially at the beginning, is going to go a long way to trying to find that kind of path that you should work on. So I think that with communities, yes, there's things which apply to all communities, transparency of the communications, understanding they want to improve their livelihoods and a fair and appropriate share of the benefits. With Indigenous peoples, those things apply, but they also regard themselves as distinct. And there are processes in many countries which identify them as distinct. And that is embedded in international law, is the idea of self-determination, that Indigenous groups see themselves as a distinct group and want to maintain and retain that differentiation from other parts of society. And that's the biggest difference. And the free, prior, and informed consent, which is in international conventions and is an obligation of countries to ensure that Indigenous peoples have free, prior, and informed consent when a mine goes ahead in their territories, is also being expected of companies too now, embedded in some of these voluntary standards. And understanding fundamentally that this isn't just a process, it's also a right, I think is going to help managers understand what are their obligations and what are the expectations of Indigenous peoples. But it's not easy at all. It does take time, and it does take a special trained person or person of a certain disposition to be able to work with Indigenous peoples groups.
What do you think are some of the key trends that we can obviously expect to see in the near future when it comes to responsible sourcing and requirements for mining in particular?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I mentioned beforehand, we've got this what we call a tsunami of regulations. There's something like 60 regulations around the world now, which have something to do with responsible sourcing or responsible supply chains. Certainly a dozen or more in the EU, which are extremely stringent compared to what we have now and immediate in terms of their application. So that isn't going to go away. I don't see that going away. Some of the European ones have been pushed out a little bit, but that doesn't mean they're going to go away. So those expectations are going to continue to be there. And so what we need is ways in which this doesn't become a massive compliance burden for companies, and trying to codify those and find them. That's actually quite a lot of TDi Sustainability does through our digital platform. We can reduce that burden of compliance by doing all the thinking for our clients in terms of the regulations and the standards that's expecting. So I think that's definitely coming. The drivers on mines at the moment regarding sustainability and ESG come from regulations for sure, but they also come from investors and customers. And that customer pressure, right, when I say customers, not the immediate customer, the right downstream companies, such as the auto, electronics, aerospace companies, they are exerting pressure. So we should expect there's going to be more interest in the downstream. I don't know if your listeners go to the mining Indaba. TDi Sustainability is a strategic partner of the Indaba, mining Indaba for this coming year. And there's an increasing number of auto companies and electronics companies which are going to the Indaba to try and understand the issue. So in some ways, mining, the industry is not just about the horizontal sector, if you want, the mining. It's now about mining and metals and mineral supply chains generally. And the expectation is that you need people who can speak to those auto companies because they're wanting to come and speak to you. So I think that's another one, that increasing pressure and dialogue between the downstream and the upstream. In terms of these sort of emergent issues, yes, I think you just got to look at the trends in society and what people are anxious about, and then figure out how that's what the expectations will be of mining companies. But, people are, of course, extremely anxious about things like climate change. And so they need to understand what mining companies do to reduce that climate change, which could be through the minerals, but what they're actually also doing on their site as well, such as using sources of renewable energy and looking at their fleets and so on and so forth. That's not going away either. But one of the biggest trends is I think, and I just seen this slowly grow over the last 20, 30 years, is it's not just about reducing the negative aspects of your business or the mining on the environment and people, but there's this expectation now that there should be a net benefit for people's lives in and around the mine as well. And so that's why we set up another organization called the Impact Facility for Sustainable Mining Communities, which allows mining companies and downstream companies to actually invest into small-scale mining operations, which are around large-scale mines, or into mining communities themselves, to demonstrate that you can actually capture some of that value that mines generate, then reinvest it into the local community, so it can last long beyond the life of the mine. And that's important too, because mines obviously are there to make money for their shareholders and return their taxes and royalties to the government. They're not development agents, so they need partners with whom they can work with to ensure that local value is captured in those communities.
What sort of impact are you seeing on mining companies in terms of obviously responsible sourcing expectations and as a result of the renewable energy transition?
Well, of course, there's a big interest now from the investment side and with juniors into critical minerals. We're working with some international development banks at the moment to develop new strategies to invest into critical minerals. And what's happening is that these international development banks, such as the World Bank and IFC, Asian Development Bank, they see that climate change is a big part of their mission. And they now realize that to address climate change, the effects of climate change, we need clean energy technologies. And those clean energy technologies need minerals, which they call critical minerals or transition minerals. So there's beginning to be now an interest in investing into critical minerals specifically, when before it might have just been around mining generally. Now they want to focus on those critical minerals. So I think that's definitely kind of one thing which is happening. And for the junior miners, of course, they'll go, well, that's welcome news, but we also have to meet their very high expectations on ESG, and that is coming too. So how can you both support junior miners who might not have the capacity or the capital to do all these things you want, while at the same time build up reserves. And then, of course, you've got kind of geopolitics, which is in there because everybody realizes that these critical minerals are important. So that's a part of it as well. But on the positive side, because those geopolitics, of course, can exclude or lead to kind of concentration in the supply chain, which is a risk in itself. But on the positive side, you're seeing more regional integration and cooperation. So how can you build corridors with critical minerals, linking them to the value-added parts of the of the supply chain as well. So really, it's a kind of a confluence of things: ESG, geopolitics, market demand, price volatility. You put that all together, and it makes it an exciting, but certainly not straightforward time for the sector.
How can companies obviously respond to a number of increased regulatory and stakeholder demands, obviously that you've outlined during this podcast, and to not just meet but exceed local legal requirements around the environmental, around obviously social government impacts of their operations? And what do you see the benefits of taking this approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's years ago, 20 years ago, I was working with one mining company, a Canadian mining company, and they had a very visionary head of corporate sustainability, or CSR as they called it then. And he was kind of way ahead of his time, which turned out to be not such a good thing, because when recession happened, the CEO said, actually, let's stick to the knitting. We got to actually dig some stuff out of the ground, and all the progress he'd made was kind of turned back or put on hold. So timing is important. But I was going to say, I think it's about anticipation. So you've got to sort of anticipate where things are headed, but then get granular about when the expectations are going to hit. Because you don't want to get the timing wrong. So we do quite a lot of work on that, is looking at these public issues, looking how important they are, and when they're going to become regulatory requirements or into standards. So there is something about looking at the big picture, see where things are headed, but then getting very kind of granular and disciplined about when you need to kind of embed it. I think that's one thing. And that allows you also to kind of prevent the aspects or the adverse impacts before they happen, and know how to demonstrate that you are doing so. I think another thing is, I kind of feel that the mining industry, when it's grumbling a little bit about the outside world, it grumbles that they're having standards imposed on them by people who don't understand mining. So I guess my response to that is, well, it's not going to go away. So it's time you actually came to the table and offered your expertise into these circles which are building these soft or hard regulations, and make sure that they're appropriate. And indeed, we're seeing that with several of the mining organizations in copper world, the Copper Mark, the ICMM, International Council for Mining and Metals, the World Gold Council, and the Mining Association of Canada, who've got together to combine their codes of conduct and their standards, and offer that to the downstream and said, look, here's a framework which works. We've been working on this. We've got your participation, and we're at the table, because I think mining needs to be at the table when these things are being set. Another thing that we've been focusing on a lot, and I mentioned this earlier, to really help companies reduce the compliance burden but meet expectation, is looking at these digital tools. So you do have this enormous amount of regulation coming up the supply chain to mining companies. What we've done is codified all that into online digital tools, which has done all the thinking for the mining industry, so that they can understand what these are, and actually start to put it into simple things like kind of checklists. So, I mean, what are the benefits of all these things, of doing all these things? I mean, the clear benefit, of course, is continued market access. I think that's going to be the thing. And there's a lot of a lot of our downstream clients, they are looking, 20, 30 years ahead. So they're going, where are we going to get these metals in 30 years' time? And that meet these expectations of our regulators. So if you can demonstrate that you've got a sure supply chain and you are also able to manage these ESG risks that they talk of, then that I think is going to be very much a long-term benefit to the industry. And then, of course, you came from the human resources sector. As long as I've been in mining, there's always been these kind of ups and downs, but increasingly challenging for the mining industry has always been to attract talent, which they need, especially as it becomes more capital intense. And you just need smarter people who want good conditions and places to live. But increasingly, they want to know that their work has purpose, and they want to understand that mining is doing a good thing. And so I think that's also not to be underestimated at all. Is how do you attract and retain talent in your companies?
How do TDI help some of their clients, and obviously in relation to responding to a lot of these requirements that you've just mentioned? Obviously, all these regulatory controls. How do you guys help some of your clients?
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, I guess the most satisfying for us is that we work at the C-suite of companies and making sure that those people who are accountable for the proper running of their businesses understand what is happening and where it's headed and what they can do about it, or how they need to change. And equally satisfying, I think, is our work actually down at the asset as well, so at the actual site. And there at the site, we specialize in the community relations, the community investments. As I mentioned, we have our sister NGO, the Impact Facility. And there we actually look at how do you actually invest into small scale enterprises in the mining communities. And things that we just talked about, like Indigenous peoples and free, prior, informed consent and human rights. So that's a lot of our work at the site, is working those businesses to make that possible. Another benefit I mentioned earlier is about kind of permitting. So some of our clients in South America are coming round to wanting to expand their mines, and they need their permits. And in order to get their permits, they got to get sign off of support from communities, Indigenous peoples groups around their mine. So it's not a small thing. So we do a lot of work on that. As prices in some minerals go up, you see artisanal and small-scale mining is also increasing. So we're specialists in artisanal and small-scale mining. That's another area we work in. Biodiversity and biodiversity loss, this has become almost equal now to climate change in its importance. And that's something that we specialize in quite a while now. How do you protect biodiversity? What's the concept of biodiversity offsets? And then we do a lot of work on the standards. How do you prepare for these certifications? How do you prepare organizational change to make sure that it's embedded, looking at the structures and the governance structures within the organization? And then finally, as I mentioned, we really want to make sure that sustainability in ESG isn't just there for the most well-off companies. So we're digitalizing a lot of the tools that we built over the last 2 decades to help mining companies address some of these ESG issues they've been asked to address, and to be able to disclose and report on their performance. So those are some of the things that we do, maybe the key things that we do.
Yeah. And lastly, what's the outlook for TDI over the sort of short to medium term? And is there anything else that you'd like to add to tell our, obviously, mining audience, who are predominantly from the mining industry from all over the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, no, I'm excited actually, because I guess for the first time in my career choosing mining, and I remember when I first did my PhD on mining, we had a department called Mining and the Environment, and university faculty wags would just cross out the "and," just became Mining the Environment. So this was the this is the unpopular, unfashionable part of the university campus for sure. But now, you can see there's a turn of a tide because of these things which we talked about, the transition minerals that are needed, and people are taking an interest now, and they realize they depend on them. And as soon as they depend on them, then they're going to figure out how to and support companies who actually want to demonstrate that it's a positive impact, that it can have a positive impact. So this is, I think I'm excited. I think there's an opportunity here now for the mining industry to demonstrate that it is actually part of and a driver of sustainable development rather than a drag on it. And hopefully we can continue to ride that wave and show value for our mining clients and for their customers.
Assheton, really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your story, telling us about TDi Sustainability and what you guys do, and obviously sharing your content around obviously ESG, responsible sourcing in supply chains. And I think obviously a lot of people that will be listening to this may obviously take note on some of the things that you've said and try and embed that in their day-to-day work and hopefully in their businesses as we sort of move forward. If our audience wants to reach out to you, if they have any questions, if they want to follow your story and what the company are doing, how can they go about doing that? What social media platform channels are you on?
That's great. Yeah. Well, our website is TDi Sustainability. I'm A Carter at TDi Sustainability, and we're on LinkedIn and Twitter under TDi Sustainability and the Impact Facility.
Yeah, we'll include those in the show notes accompanying this anyway, for easy access to all our listeners that are listening to this. Really appreciate your time again, and hope business is good for you for the remainder of the year going into 2025.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Hope you enjoyed that episode. As always, appreciate if you can share this episode far and wide. Obviously, it's an important subject, responsible sourcing and ESG, as Assheton has highlighted. So appreciate your continued support. Please share this within our industry, but also, as I always say, outside of our industry as well, because we need to improve the image and branding of mining. We can only do this by informing and educating those outside of our industry in what we do within. So, as always, appreciate your help. And until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.